Good evening and welcome back. Tonight, we journey to the heights of Mount Olympus, to the throne of the god who shaped the cosmos itself. The king of gods, the wielder of thunder, the father of both deities and heroes. Get comfortable, settle in, and let's explore the complete story of Zeus. From his desperate birth in a hidden cave to his reign over heaven and earth. This is a tale of power, prophecy, passion, and the price of absolute authority. Before Zeus ever drew breath, before lightning ever split the sky, there was fear. Not the simple fear of mortals facing death, but the deeper, colder fear of a god who knew his own doom was coming. Cronus, king of the Titans, ruler of the Golden Age, sat upon his throne and felt the weight of prophecy crushing down upon him like the sky itself. His father, Uranus, had warned him. His mother, Gaia, had whispered it. One day, one of his own children would rise up and cast him down, just as he had overthrown Uranus before him. The cycle of succession was ancient, carved into the fabric of existence itself. Son against father, new against old. Power never rested in the same hands forever. Cronus had learned this lesson when he took his father's great sickle and castrated Uranus, ending his reign with violence and blood. Now that same terrible knowledge haunted him. His wife Rhea, daughter of the same primordial powers, bore child after child, and with each birth, Cronus saw not a son or daughter, but a potential usurper, a future king waiting to steal his crown. So he made a choice that would echo through eternity. As each child emerged from Rhea's womb, Cronus would take the infant in his massive hands, open his jaws wide, and swallow them whole. Not dead, for gods cannot die so easily, but imprisoned in the darkness of his belly, trapped in an eternal prison of flesh and fear. First came Hestia, goddess of the hearth, barely taking her first breath before vanishing down her father's throat. Then Demeter, who would have blessed the earth with grain and growth. Then Hera, proud and regal even as an infant. Then Hades, dark-eyed and silent. Then Poseidon, already bearing the temperament of storms. 5 children swallowed, 5 potential threats contained. And Rhea, forced to witness this horror again and again, her maternal heart breaking with each birth, each loss. She was a goddess, yes, but she was also a mother. And there is no power in the cosmos that can fully protect a mother's heart from that kind of grief. Her arms ached with emptiness, her breasts heavy with milk that would never be drunk. She watched her husband's paranoid eyes, saw how he never truly relaxed, how he constantly scanned the horizon for threats that had not yet materialized. When Rhea felt the 6th child quickening in her womb, something changed within her. This time would be different. She would not hand over another child to Cronus's mad hunger. She would not watch another infant disappear into darkness. But how could she defy the king of the Titans? How could she hide a god from a god? She needed help, and there was only one place to turn, to the beginning, to the source of all things, to her mother, Gaia, the earth herself, and her father, Uranus, the sky. Though Uranus had been wounded and diminished by Cronus's blade, his voice still carried wisdom. And Gaia's power ran deeper than any Titan's throne. They devised a plan together, whispered in the secret language of earth and stone. When Rhea's labor began, she did not go to Cronus's palace. Instead, guided by Gaia, she traveled to the island of Crete, to a place where mountains rose like ancient gods and caves opened like mouths in the earth. Some accounts place this cave on Mount Ida, others on Mount Dicte. But all agree on the secrecy, the sacred nature of what happened there. Deep in the mountain's belly, where no sunlight reached, where the air was thick with the smell of stone and soil, Rhea gave birth to her 6th child. The infant's cry was strong, fierce, already carrying the authority of thunder. His eyes, even newborn, held a clarity that spoke of destiny. Rhea held him for just a moment, pressing him to her chest, feeling his warmth, his reality. She named him Zeus, which in the ancient tongue meant bright sky, the light above. Then, knowing Cronus would soon come looking, she handed the baby to Gaia. The earth goddess took the infant with arms that had cradled the first generation of gods, and she spirited him away to a hidden cave deeper in Mount Ida's heart. But Rhea's work was not finished. She found a stone, roughly the size and weight of a newborn, and wrapped it carefully in swaddling clothes. She held it as she would hold a child, walked as she would walk, carrying something precious. When she returned to Cronus, her face showed the exhaustion of childbirth, her arms cradling the bundle. Cronus barely looked at it. In some versions of the tale, Rhea even pressed her breast against the stone before handing it over, and milk sprayed across the heavens, creating the river of stars mortals would later call the Milky Way. Cronus took what he thought was his newest child and, without ceremony or hesitation, swallowed it whole. The stone, which would later be called the Omphalos, dropped into his belly alongside the 5 imprisoned gods. Cronus felt satisfied, secure. Another threat neutralized, another piece of the prophecy delayed. He did not know that, even as the stone settled in his gut, far away in a Cretan cave, his doom was taking its first breath. Zeus's childhood was unlike any other god's. Hidden in the sacred cave, he could not be raised in palaces or taught in the halls of Titan kings. His nursery was stone and shadow, his lullabies the dripping of underground water and the whisper of wind through narrow passages. But he was not alone. Gaia had arranged for guardians, protectors, who would ensure this child survived to fulfill his destiny. First came Amalthea. In most tellings, she was a goat, but not an ordinary one. Her milk was divine nectar, rich with immortal power. The infant Zeus suckled at her teats and grew strong on her blessing. Some versions speak of Amalthea as a nymph who owned the goat, but either way, the creature's role was vital. Her milk did more than nourish. It made Zeus powerful, filled him with a vitality that would one day shake the foundations of the world. When Amalthea died, Zeus honored her by placing her in the heavens as the constellation Capricorn, and from one of her broken horns came the cornucopia, the horn of plenty that could produce endless abundance. But feeding the child was only half the challenge. Sound was the danger. Babies cry, and Zeus was no exception. If Cronus heard those cries echoing from Crete, if he discovered that his youngest child lived, he would come with all his terrible power to finish what he'd started. So Gaia arranged for another kind of protection. She called upon the Curetes, also known as the Choretes, warrior dancers who served the old powers of the earth. These were not ordinary men. Some said they were lesser gods or divine spirits, armed with bronze shields and spears. Their task was simple but exhausting. Whenever Zeus cried, whenever his infant voice rose in the cave, the Curetes would dance. They would clash their shields together, bang their spears against bronze, create a cacophony of sound that drowned out the baby's wails. They danced without rest, whirling and leaping, making such noise that any wandering Titan would hear only the sound of ritual celebration, never suspecting that beneath the clamor, a child was growing who would one day overthrow their king. Other stories say that Zeus was suspended in a cradle between earth, sea, and sky, hanging in the space that belonged to none of Cronus's domains, making him impossible to locate. The nymphs of Crete brought honey from sacred bees to sweeten his lips. Some accounts mention that his grandmother Gaia herself visited, or that the goddess Themis took a hand in his upbringing, teaching him wisdom even as an infant. The young god grew quickly, as divine children do, and with each passing season, he became more aware of who he was and why he had been hidden. Zeus learned patience in that cave. He learned to wait, to plan, to think before acting. The darkness taught him to see in new ways. The constant protection taught him the value of loyalty. The stories the nymphs told him, stories of his imprisoned siblings, of his father's tyranny, of the prophecy that hung over everything. These stories shaped him. He was not just growing in size and strength, he was growing in purpose. As the years passed and Zeus moved from infant to child to youth, the cave became too small for him. His power was too great to be fully contained. Lightning would occasionally crackle around his fingertips when he dreamed. Thunder rumbled in his chest when he laughed. The Curites dancing became less about hiding his cries and more about concealing the signs of his growing divinity. But Zeus was careful. He had learned control. He had learned to mask his power, to appear less than he was, because he knew that one day he would need every advantage to face his father. The moment came when Zeus reached full adulthood, when his form had grown tall and strong, when his eyes had sharpened with intelligence and determination. He could remain hidden no longer, nor did he wish to. The prophecy that had driven Cronus to madness, the same prophecy that had saved Zeus's life, now called for fulfillment. It was time to end the age of Titans. It was time to free his siblings and claim his birthright. But Zeus was no fool. He had spent his entire life listening to stories of Cronus's power, learning about the Titans who served him, understanding the forces arrayed against any who would challenge the throne. He could not simply march up to his father and demand justice. He needed a strategy. He needed help. He found it in Metis, the Oceanid goddess of wisdom and cunning thought. She was a daughter of Oceanus and Tethys, part of the older generation, but not aligned with Cronus's brutal rule. She had watched the king of Titans with growing disgust, seen how fear and paranoia had twisted him. When Zeus came to her, explaining his identity and his purpose, Metis saw in him something Cronus had lost: hope, justice, the possibility of a better order. She agreed to help him, and their alliance would prove crucial, though it would later end in tragedy. Together, Zeus and Metis crafted a plan. They would not attack Cronus directly, not yet. First, they would weaken him from within. Metis prepared a special potion. Its exact ingredients lost to time, but its effects legendary. Some versions say it was an emetic, designed to cause vomiting. Others suggest it was mixed with wine or honey, something that would disguise its true nature. The key was getting Cronus to drink it. For that, Zeus needed to get close to his father, and he had a perfect disguise. He was unknown. A young god Cronus had never seen, supposedly swallowed before he could ever become a threat. Zeus approached Cronus's palace, presenting himself as a cupbearer, a servant who would attend the king and pour his drinks. It seems almost absurd that the king of Titans would not recognize his own son, but remember, Cronus thought Zeus had been swallowed decades ago. He saw only a strong young god seeking employment, and in his arrogance, Cronus accepted him into his service. Zeus bided his time, serving Cronus his wine each day, watching and learning. He saw how his father sat on the throne, how the other Titans deferred to him, how the golden age Cronus had ushered in had become tarnished by his fear and cruelty. Then, when the moment was right, Zeus poured the cup. He added Metis's potion to Cronus's wine, masking its bitter taste with sweet honey. Cronus, never suspecting, drank deeply. The effect was not immediate, but it was inexorable. Cronus's stomach, which had held 5 gods prisoner for so long, began to rebel. A terrible nausea gripped him. His mighty frame doubled over, and then, before the assembled Titans, before his court, Cronus vomited. First came the stone, the false Zeus that Rhea had given him, tumbling from his mouth and clattering on the floor. Cronus stared at it in confusion, his mind struggling to comprehend. Then came the gods, one after another, emerging not as infants, but as fully grown deities. Poseidon came first, or perhaps Hestia. The order varies in the telling, but what matters is that they came alive, aware, and absolutely furious. Hades emerged with eyes full of dark understanding, Hera with regal dignity despite her humiliation, Demeter with the patient strength of the earth, Poseidon with the rage of a storm held too long in check, Hestia with the quiet, enduring flame of the hearth. All 5, aged to adulthood by their time in their father's belly, stepped forth and saw their youngest brother standing there, the one who had saved them, the one they had never known. The recognition was instant. They saw Zeus's face, saw the resemblance to their mother Rhea, understood immediately what had happened. They also saw Cronus, weakened and bewildered, still trying to grasp what was occurring. Zeus did not give him time to recover. He declared himself, announced his true identity, and pronounced judgment on his father. The age of fear was over. The time of justice had begun. But speaking such words and making them reality are two very different things. Cronus was still king of the Titans, still commanded immense power, and the palace was full of beings who had served him for ages beyond counting. Zeus and his siblings were outnumbered, outmatched, and standing in the heart of enemy territory. They fled, not out of cowardice, but out of strategic necessity. They needed time to prepare, to gather allies, to build an army. They made their way to a mountain in the north, a peak called Olympus, so tall its summit pierced the clouds. There they established their base, their fortress, their future home. And there Zeus began to plan for war. The Titanomachy was about to begin. The greatest conflict in cosmic history was gathering like storm clouds on the horizon, and nothing would ever be the same again. The war between the Titans and the Olympians was not sudden. It did not explode into being overnight. Rather, it built slowly, like pressure building deep in the earth before an earthquake. Both sides took time to marshal their forces, to call in favors, to prepare for a conflict that would determine the very structure of reality. Cronus, recovering from the shock of disgorging his children, called his siblings to Mount Olympus in the south, the traditional seat of Titan power. The mountain was ancient and strong, wrapped in the authority of the old ways. There, Cronus made his case. Zeus was a usurper, a child who didn't understand the responsibilities of power, who would bring chaos if allowed to rule. Several Titans answered Cronus's call. Iapetus came, fierce and warlike, bringing with him his sons Atlas and Menœtius. Hyperion arrived, lord of light before there were sun gods to claim the title. Coeus and Creus, both brothers of Cronus, sided with the old king out of loyalty or fear. Thea, Mnemosyne, Phoebe, and Tethys, the Titanesses who had helped shape the early world, aligned themselves with Mount Olympus. Not all the Titans chose Cronus's side, however. Notably, Oceanus, the great river that circled the world, remained neutral, too old and wise to throw himself into this particular conflict. And crucially, Themis, goddess of divine law and justice, looked at what Cronus had become and made a different choice. Themis joined Zeus on Mount Olympus. With her came her clear vision of justice, her understanding that the age of Titans had grown corrupt, that Cronus's fear had poisoned his rule. Her son Prometheus, the Titan blessed with foresight, also sided with the Olympians, for he had seen how this war would end, and he chose to stand with the winners. His brother Epimetheus came with him. These defections were important, for they showed that this was not simply young against old. This was a battle between different visions of how the cosmos should be ordered, between paranoid tyranny and the promise of something better. But Zeus knew that even with these allies, the Olympians were outmatched. The Titans had ruled for ages. They had power that came from the dawn of time itself. He needed more than a few defectors from the old guard. He needed something that would tilt the balance decisively in his favor. So he made a journey, one fraught with danger. He descended into the earth itself, down through layers of stone and darkness, down into the deepest part of the underworld, to the prison called Tartarus. This was where Cronus had imprisoned his own siblings, the Cyclopes and the Hecatoncheires, the 100-handed ones, locking them away as his father Uranus had done before him. The way to Tartarus was guarded by Campe, a she-dragon of terrible power, placed there specifically to ensure that nothing escaped the abyss. Zeus battled her in the darkness, his natural power flaring for the first time in true combat. Lightning blazed in the depths. The clash was brutal and short. Zeus slew Campi, her blood painting the stones, and pressed onto the prison itself. There he found the Cyclopes, three beings whose single eyes gleamed with imprisoned rage. Brontes, Steropes, and Arges, masters of thunder, lightning, and brightness respectively. They had been trapped in darkness for so long they had almost forgotten what their craft could create. Zeus broke their chains. He freed them with a promise. Join him in this war, help him overthrow Cronus, and never again would they be imprisoned for their appearance or their power. The Cyclopes, feeling freedom for the first time in ages, looked at this young god who had risked everything to release them, and they agreed. In gratitude, they forged weapons such as the world had never seen. For Zeus, they crafted the thunderbolt, a weapon of pure lightning that could split the sky and shake the earth. It was not just a tool of destruction, but a symbol of authority, the ultimate expression of storm power. For Poseidon, Zeus's brother who commanded the loyalty of water, they forged a trident, a three-pronged spear that could stir the seas into fury or calm them with a gesture. For Hades, the darkest of the siblings who would one day rule the dead, they crafted the helm of darkness, a crown that made its wearer invisible, allowing him to move unseen through any battlefield. Armed with these weapons, Zeus descended even deeper into Tartarus. There he found the Hecatoncheires, the 100-handed ones. Cottus, Briareus, and Gyges were monsters by any standard, each possessing 50 heads and 100 arms, beings of such raw power that even the Titans had feared them. They had been imprisoned even longer than the Cyclopes, buried so deep that some had forgotten they existed. Zeus freed them as well, and their gratitude was even more profound. Beings of such strength who could hurl mountains like stones, who could fight 100 foes simultaneously, now swore themselves to Zeus's cause. The balance of power had shifted. The Olympians now had weapons and warriors to match the Titans. The war, when it finally erupted in full, was cataclysmic. Imagine the earth itself tearing apart, the sky burning, the seas boiling with rage. For 10 years, the battle raged without pause. The Titans fought from Mount Olympus in the south. The Olympians fought from Mount Olympus in the north. Between them, the world suffered. Mountains were torn from their foundations and hurled as weapons. Rivers boiled away to nothing. Forests burned, and the smoke blotted out the sun. Mortal creatures that existed in those days, if any did, would have huddled in caves or the depths of the ocean, praying for the gods to end their conflict. Zeus stood at the center of the Olympian forces, his thunderbolts lighting up the battlefield with terrifying regularity. Each throw was a flash of judgment, a strike that could reduce a mountain to rubble or send a titan reeling. Poseidon commanded waves of water to crash against the titan lines, floods that swept away entire armies. Hades moved unseen through the chaos, striking from unexpected angles, spreading fear and confusion. Hera, Hestia, and Demeter held the defensive lines, ensuring that no titan breakthrough could reach Olympus itself. On the other side, Cronus wielded the same sickle that had once overthrown his father, trying to reclaim the authority he'd lost. Atlas, who had been named second in command of the Titan forces, fought with the strength of one who could bear the entire world. Iapetus matched Zeus's lightning with his own fierce attacks. Hyperion blazed with the light of ancient suns. The battle was not just physical. It was a clash of wills, of fundamental philosophies about power and rule. Would the cosmos be governed by fear and control, or by justice tempered with strength? The Cyclopes worked tirelessly, forging more weapons, replenishing the Olympian arsenal. The Hecatoncheires were everywhere at once, their 100 hands flinging boulders at such speed that the air itself screamed. They created barrages that looked like meteor storms, each rock carrying enough force to shatter stone. The Titans, for all their power, had no answer to this. They had relied on their individual strength, on their ancient authority, but the Olympians fought as a coordinated force, each god playing to their strengths, covering each other's weaknesses. Slowly, inexorably, the tide turned. The Titans were pushed back, their lines broken, their confidence shattered. Cronus, seeing his reign crumbling, fought with the desperation of a king who knows he's witnessing his own end. But even his fury could not turn back what was coming. Zeus, wielding his thunderbolt, struck Cronus down, not killing him, for gods are not so easily slain, but defeating him utterly, removing his power, breaking his authority. One by one, the other Titans fell or surrendered. Some were struck by lightning. Some were overwhelmed by the Hecatonchyres. Some simply stopped fighting when they saw Cronus defeated, understanding that the prophecy had been fulfilled, that the age of Titans was over. The victorious Olympians showed no mercy to those who had sided with Cronus. They were not content to simply remove them from power. They dragged the defeated Titans down through the layers of the world, down to Tartarus, the same prison from which Zeus had freed the Cyclopes and Hecatonchyres. The irony was not lost on anyone. Cronus, who had imprisoned his siblings, was now imprisoned himself. The bronze gates of Tartarus clanged shut, and the Hecatonchyres took up positions as guards, ensuring that no Titan would ever escape. Atlas alone received a different, arguably worse punishment. For his role as battlefield commander against the Olympians, he was sentenced to hold up the sky itself for all eternity, his massive shoulders bearing the weight of the heavens, a living reminder of the price of rebellion against Zeus's new order. Not all Titans were imprisoned. Those who had sided with Zeus, Themis and Prometheus most notably, were honored and given places in the new cosmic order. Oceanus, who had remained neutral, was allowed to continue his ancient work, flowing around the world. But the majority of the old powers were locked away, and with their defeat, the world entered a new age. The Titanomachy was over. The Olympians had won. But victory brought new questions. With Cronus dethroned and the Titans imprisoned, who would rule what? How would the cosmos be divided? The war had unified the Olympians in purpose, but now came the harder task. Governance, power sharing, building something that would last. Zeus stood on the battlefield, still holding his thunderbolt, and looked at his brothers. Poseidon's eyes held the depths of the sea. Hades's gaze was dark with understanding. 3 brothers, equally powerful, each with a claim to rule. How could they divide the world without sparking another war? The answer would shape everything that followed. The problem was delicate. Zeus, Poseidon, and Hades had fought together, bled together, defeated their father together. Each had proven his worth, his power, his right to authority. But there could only be one supreme ruler, one ultimate king. The cosmos was vast, yes, but infinite power in multiple hands is simply a formula for conflict. They needed a solution that honored all 3 while establishing a clear hierarchy. The solution they chose was ancient and fair. They would cast lots, let fate itself decide the division of the world. Some accounts say they drew straws. Others speak of dice or marked stones drawn from a helmet. The method matters less than the result. 3 brothers, 3 domains, 3 aspects of reality. When the lots were drawn, when fate made its pronouncement, the world was divided thusly. Zeus drew the sky, the broad heavens, the air and clouds, the realm of storms and weather. It was the highest place, the vantage point from which all could be seen, the position of ultimate authority. He became lord of the atmosphere, king of thunder and lightning, ruler of Mount Olympus itself. The sky was his throne room, lightning his scepter. From this height, he would govern both gods and mortals, dispensing justice, enforcing oaths, maintaining the order they had fought to establish. Poseidon drew the sea, all the waters of the world, from the salty depths of the ocean to the rivers that carved through continents, from the springs that bubbled from hillsides to the rain that fell from Zeus's clouds. The sea was vast, temperamental, full of mystery and monsters. It suited Poseidon perfectly. for he carried that same wildness in his soul. He built his palace beneath the waves, a magnificent structure of coral and gold, where he ruled over not just water, but all the creatures that lived within it. Nereids and Tritons became his subjects. Sea serpents and leviathans answered to his command. When Poseidon struck the ocean floor with his trident, earthquakes shook the world. When he stirred the waters into fury, ships were swallowed and coastlines reshaped. Hades drew the underworld, the realm of the dead, the shadowed kingdom beneath the earth, where all mortal souls eventually traveled. It was not a punishment, though many would later see it that way. Someone had to rule the dead, to maintain order in that grey realm, to ensure that the boundary between life and death remained intact. Hades accepted this role with stern dignity. He built his own palace in the depths, a dark mirror to Zeus's bright Olympus and Poseidon's oceanic splendor. His wife would eventually be Persephone, though that story would come later. His kingdom held Tartarus as its deepest level, where the Titans languished, but also the asphodel fields where ordinary souls wandered, and eventually the Elysian fields where heroes found rest. The earth itself, Gaia's body, remained common to all three brothers. No single god would rule it outright. Mortals could walk its surface without answering solely to one divine authority. The mountains belonged to none and to all. The forests grew wild under no single banner. This was meant to be a neutral ground, a shared space where the domains overlapped. In practice, of course, mortals quickly learned that the earth was where the gods' conflicts played out, where their jealousies and passions affected human lives, where prayers rose up and divine judgment rained down. With the domains divided, Zeus claimed his position as king of the gods, not because he had drawn the best lot, though the sky was certainly symbolically superior, but because his role in the war had marked him as leader. He had freed his siblings. He had planned the campaign. He had freed the Cyclopes and Hecatoncheires. He had struck down Cronus. The others acknowledged his authority, some more readily than others. Poseidon occasionally chafed under Zeus's rule, feeling that his own realm made him Zeus's equal. Hades, more solitary by nature, simply retreated to his kingdom and ruled there without interference. But Zeus's word became law. His judgments were final. His power was supreme, not because he was the oldest or necessarily the strongest in raw force, but because he had proven himself the most capable of leadership. On Mount Olympus, Zeus established his court. The other Olympian gods began to gather. Hera, his sister, would become his queen, though their relationship would be notoriously stormy. Hestia, the eldest, took her place as goddess of the hearth, the eternal flame that burned at the center of Olympus. Demeter became goddess of the harvest, ensuring that mortals would have grain to sustain them. New gods joined the pantheon, born from the unions of the original Olympians, or emerging from other sources. Athena would spring from Zeus's own head. Apollo and Artemis would be born to Leto. Hermes would arrive as Zeus's clever messenger. Ares would embody war. Aphrodite would rise from the sea foam, bringing love and desire. Hephaestus would forge at his anvil, creating wonders of metalwork. Dionysus would later join, bringing wine and ecstasy. This new order was more complex than the Titan rule had been, where Cronus had governed through fear and maintained his throne by swallowing threats. Zeus ruled through a combination of power, wisdom, and political maneuvering. He rewarded loyalty. Styx, the river goddess who had been first to bring her children to fight for the Olympians, was honored above all other rivers. Her name became the most sacred oath a god could swear, binding even Zeus himself. Her children, Nike, Kratos, Bia, and Zelos, representing victory, strength, force, and rivalry, became Zeus's constant attendants, standing guard at his throne. Zeus also understood the importance of justice tempered with mercy. While he had imprisoned the Titans who fought against him, he didn't seek to destroy them utterly. In some later accounts, He eventually released those titans who had fought well, recognizing that eternal imprisonment served no purpose once his rule was secure. He assigned roles and responsibilities to the gods, creating a divine bureaucracy that would manage the affairs of both heaven and earth. Each god had their domain, their sphere of influence, their duties. This created a system that was both hierarchical and functional, with Zeus at the top, but each deity holding real power within their area. But establishing a new cosmic order was one thing. Maintaining it would prove far more difficult. Zeus's rule would be constantly tested, not just by external threats, but by his own nature, his own decisions, his own passions. The greatest king of gods was about to discover that power came with complications that no thunderbolt could solve. First among those complications would be his relationships, his marriages, his countless affairs, and the children they produced. Zeus's personal life would become legendary, a tangled web of love, lust, jealousy, and divine offspring that would reshape the world again and again. And at the center of that web, watching with burning jealousy, would be Hera, the goddess who became his final and most enduring wife. Before Hera became his queen, before the storms of their marriage shook Olympus, Zeus took other wives. This was not unusual for the time, not seen as wrong or shameful. In the ordering of the cosmos, different goddesses represented different aspects of rule, different kinds of wisdom Zeus needed to establish his reign properly. His first wife, and perhaps the most significant, was Metis, the Oceanid, who had helped him defeat Cronus. Metis was wisdom personified, cunning thought given form. She was beautiful, yes, but more importantly, she was clever, insightful, able to see solutions where others saw only problems. Zeus married her soon after the Titanomachy, recognizing that a king needed wise counsel as much as military might. Their union seemed perfect. Metis advised Zeus on matters of governance, helped him navigate the complex politics of establishing a new pantheon, taught him when to be merciful and when to be firm. She became pregnant with their first child, and Zeus looked forward to being a father in a way that Cronus never had. But then prophecy reared its head again. That same curse that had haunted Cronus now reached for Zeus. Gaia and Uranus, whether out of wisdom or mischief, revealed to Zeus that Metis was fated to bear 2 children. The first would be a daughter of immense wisdom and power, but the second would be a son, and this son would be greater than his father, destined to overthrow Zeus, just as Zeus had overthrown Cronus, just as Cronus had overthrown Uranus. The cycle of succession threatened to continue. Zeus, who had built his entire identity around breaking that cycle, around establishing a permanent order, faced a terrible choice. He could let Metis carry both children to term and hope to prevent the prophecy through other means. Or he could act preemptively, as his father had, and stop the threat before it materialized. Zeus chose action, but he was craftier than Cronus had been. He didn't simply try to swallow his children. He went to the source. He convinced Metis to play a game with him, a game of transformation, where they would each take different forms. When Metis turned herself into a fly, small and helpless, Zeus swallowed her whole. It was not the same as Cronus's child-eating, but it wasn't entirely different either. Metis was trapped inside Zeus's body, still alive, still conscious, but unable to escape, unable to give birth to the son who would overthrow him. The prophecy was broken, or at least delayed indefinitely. But Metis's daughter had already been conceived, and divine pregnancy follows different rules than mortal gestation. Inside Zeus, Metis continued her work. She shaped their daughter, gave her wisdom, armored her in divine bronze. And when the time came, when the child was ready to be born, she could not emerge through normal means. Zeus began to suffer terrible headaches, pounding pain that even his godly constitution couldn't ignore. Finally, in desperation, Zeus called for Hephaestus, the smith god. He ordered him to strike Zeus's head with an axe, to cleave it open and see what was causing such agony. Hephaestus, reluctant but obedient, swung his axe. Zeus's skull split open, and from the wound sprang Athena, fully grown, fully armored, bearing a spear and shield, her eyes blazing with intelligence and battle-ready fury. She gave a war cry that shook Olympus, then stepped calmly before her father, already his equal in many ways, already destined to become one of the greatest of the Olympian gods. Zeus's head healed instantly, the wound closing as if it had never been, and inside him, Metis remained, still offering counsel, still whispering wisdom, now literally part of Zeus's own mind. He had gained her knowledge permanently, absorbed it into his very being. In a sense, he had become what she offered, wisdom and cunning forever integrated into his rule. Zeus's second wife was Themis, the Titaness who had sided with him during the war. Themis represented divine law, natural order, the way things should be. She was solemn and serious, not given to emotion or passion, but Zeus needed what she offered. A new cosmic order required laws, principles, structures that would govern how gods and mortals interacted. Themis became his partner in creating these laws. Together, they established the foundations of justice, the rules that even gods would be expected to follow. Their union produced remarkable children. First came the Horae, goddesses of the seasons. Their names were Eunomia, representing good order, Dike, representing justice, and Irene, representing peace. These three embodied the essential elements of a well-governed cosmos. Then came the Moirai, the three fates, Clotho, Lachesis, and Atropos, who spun, measured, and cut the threads of every life. Even Zeus himself would be bound by the fates' decisions, for they represented something older and deeper than any single god's will. Zeus's third marriage was to Eurynome, an Oceanid described as a beautiful ocean nymph. Their union produced the three graces, the charities. Aglaia embodied splendor and glory, Euphrosyne brought joy and mirth, and Thalia represented festivity and celebration. These goddesses added beauty and pleasure to the cosmos, reminding everyone that rule was not only about power and law, but also about joy and celebration. The Graces would dance at divine festivals, attend important ceremonies, and generally bring lightness to Olympus. Next came Demeter, Zeus's own sister. Their relationship was complicated, as most divine romances were. Demeter resisted Zeus's advances initially, but he persisted, in some accounts taking the form of a bull to overcome her resistance. From their union came Persephone, who would later become central to one of Greek mythology's most important stories. Persephone's eventual abduction by Hades and Demeter's grief would create the seasons, winter coming when mother and daughter were separated, spring returning when they reunited. Zeus's fifth wife was Mnemosyne, the Titaness of memory. He spent 9 consecutive nights with her, and from those 9 nights of passion came 9 daughters, the Muses. Calliope represented epic poetry. Clio embodied history. Erato inspired love poetry. Euterpe brought music and lyric poetry. Melpomene represented tragedy. Polyhymnia brought sacred hymns. Terpsichore inspired dance. Thalia, not to be confused with the Grace of the same name, represented comedy. And Urania embodied astronomy. The Muses would become essential to human culture, inspiring artists, poets, musicians, and scholars throughout history. Zeus's sixth wife was Leto, a titaness of considerable beauty and gentleness. When she became pregnant with Zeus's children, she already knew it would bring trouble. Hera had by this point become Zeus's primary consort and was growing increasingly jealous of his affairs. Hera's wrath fell heavily on Leto, forbidding any land to give her shelter, cursing her to wander homeless and give birth in a place that saw neither sun nor stars. Leto, in terrible pain, searched desperately for sanctuary. Finally, the floating island of Delos, which belonged to no fixed location, agreed to harbor her. There, Leto gave birth to twins. First came Artemis, who emerged painlessly and then immediately assisted her mother in delivering her twin brother, Apollo. Both children would grow to become major Olympian gods, Artemis ruling over the hunt and wilderness, Apollo claiming dominion over light, music, prophecy, and healing. Then came Hera, Zeus's seventh and final wife. Or rather, Hera returned to the forefront, for she had always been there, always been part of his life. She was his sister, yes, but also the goddess of marriage, queenship, and childbirth. She was regal, powerful, proud, and deeply aware of her own dignity. The story of how Zeus courted Hera is telling. He didn't simply command her to marry him, as he might have done with his position as king. Instead, he transformed himself into a cuckoo bird, small and seemingly helpless, caught in a rainstorm. The bird flew to Hera, bedraggled and pitiful, and she, moved by compassion, took it to her breast to warm and shelter it. Once secured in her embrace, Zeus transformed back into his divine form. He had breached her defenses, gotten past her dignity and pride, reached her compassionate heart. He then seduced her, and afterward, to preserve her honor, offered her marriage. Hera accepted, and their wedding became the first great ceremony of the Olympian age. All the gods attended. The Hesperides brought golden apples from their garden as gifts. The celebration lasted 300 years in divine time, and when it was over, Hera became Queen of Olympus, Zeus's official consort, the goddess by his side on the throne. But if Zeus thought marriage to Hera would settle his romantic life, he was profoundly mistaken. Their marriage would become legendary for all the wrong reasons. Hera was the goddess of marriage, devoted to the sanctity of the marital bond, while Zeus was, to put it mildly, unfaithful, persistently, constantly, almost compulsively unfaithful. He pursued goddesses, nymphs, and mortal women with equal enthusiasm, transforming into various shapes to seduce them, granting them his attentions, and leaving behind children who would reshape the world. And Hera, watching from Olympus, grew increasingly furious. She could not punish Zeus directly. He was too powerful, the king of gods, wielder of the thunderbolt. But the objects of his affection, his lovers, his illegitimate children, these were fair game in Hera's eyes. She became known for her vengeful rage, pursuing Zeus's paramours with terrible persistence, transforming them into animals, driving them mad, arranging their deaths, or at minimum making their lives miserable. Io, a priestess Zeus loved, was transformed into a cow and tormented by a gadfly sent by Hera to sting her constantly. Europa, the Phoenician princess Zeus abducted while disguised as a bull, was hounded across lands. Callisto was turned into a bear. Semele, princess of Thebes, was tricked by Hera into demanding Zeus show her his true form, which immediately immolated her, though Zeus managed to save their unborn child Dionysus. The marriage of Zeus and Hera became a celestial soap opera, full of infidelity, jealousy, punishment, and occasional reconciliation. They had children together. Ares, the god of war, savage and brutal. Hebe, goddess of youth, who would eventually marry Heracles. Eileithyia, goddess of childbirth. And in some accounts, Hephaestus, though other versions say Hera, birthed him alone in retaliation for Zeus birthing Athena without her. But despite these legitimate offspring, despite the official status of their marriage, Zeus never stopped his extramarital activities, and Hera never stopped being furious about them. Why did Zeus behave this way? Was it simple lust? Certainly that played a role. But there's more to it than mere appetite. Many of Zeus's affairs served political purposes, binding him to different regions, different cities, different lineages. The children he fathered with mortal women became heroes, founders of dynasties, kings who traced their authority back to divine blood. Perseus, Heracles, Helen of Troy, Minos of Crete, all carried Zeus's heritage, and helped establish his worship across the Greek world. In this sense, Zeus's promiscuity was also a form of cosmic governance, spreading his influence, creating allies, ensuring that no corner of the world was beyond his reach. But this explanation never satisfied Hera. To her, each affair was a betrayal, each illegitimate child a slap in the face. She was the goddess of marriage, and her own marriage was a mockery of everything she represented. The irony was not lost on anyone. The Queen of Heaven, who blessed marital unions and punished adultery among mortals, could not control her own husband's wandering. It must have been maddening for her, this constant humiliation. Yet she endured, because she was Hera, because she was queen, because leaving Zeus would mean abandoning the power and position she had fought to secure. Their fights were legendary. Thunder would shake Olympus when they argued. Other gods learned to stay out of their way when Hera's jealous rage or Zeus's defensive anger flared up. Once, according to Homer, Hera led a conspiracy against Zeus, joining with Poseidon and Athena to bind the king of gods while he slept. They nearly succeeded, wrapping him in chains, but Thetis, the sea nymph, summoned Briareus, one of the Hecatoncheires, to Olympus. The 100-handed giant freed Zeus, and the conspirators faced his thunderous wrath. Zeus threatened terrible punishments. He reminded them that his power was absolute, that he could cast any god down to Tartarus if he chose. The rebellion ended quickly, but it revealed something important. Even Zeus, for all his power, could be challenged. Even the king of gods had to maintain his authority through a combination of strength and political skill. Zeus's 7 marriages had given him multiple families, dozens of children, alliances with various divine factions, but they had also created complications that would echo through mythology for ages. His relationship with Hera was toxic, but unbreakable. His absorbed first wife Metis whispered constantly in his mind, reminding him of prophecies and threats. His other wives and their children formed a complex network of loyalties and resentments that made governing Olympus an exercise in diplomatic skill as much as divine power. And still, Zeus was not done fathering children. His affairs with mortals would produce some of mythology's greatest heroes and some of its greatest tragedies. But before we delve into those stories, we need to understand what happened after Zeus secured his throne, because victory over the Titans was not the end of threats to his rule. The greatest challenge was yet to come, a threat so terrible that all of Olympus would tremble before it. This was the creature called Typhon, and his battle with Zeus would shake the very foundations of the world. The cosmos had been reorganized. The Titans were imprisoned. Zeus ruled from Olympus with his siblings and the new generation of gods by his side. It seemed that order had finally been established, that the prophesied cycle of succession had been broken. But Gaia, the earth herself, was not satisfied. She had given birth to the Titans. She had counseled Zeus on how to defeat Cronus. She had helped establish this new order. And how had she been repaid? Her children, the Titans, were locked in Tartarus, suffering in darkness. The giants, another group of her offspring, had fought against the Olympians in the Titanomachy and been defeated. Gaia looked at this pattern and saw that Zeus, for all his talk of justice, was simply another king, crushing anyone who threatened his power. So the earth, patient and ancient, decided to birth one more child. One final creation that would test the Olympians, that would challenge Zeus's supremacy, that might end his reign entirely. She lay with Tartarus, the deepest abyss, the place of ultimate darkness and torment. From that union of earth and abyss came Typhon, also called Typhoeus, a creature of such monstrosity, such power, such terror, that even describing him strains mortal language. Typhon was enormous, larger than mountains, tall enough that his head scraped the stars when he stood upright. His body from the waist down was composed of massive coiled serpents, not legs, but dozens of vipers writhing and hissing, each one capable of crushing an elephant. His upper body was humanoid but monstrous, covered in scales, rippling with impossible strength. But most terrible of all were his heads. Some accounts say he had 100 dragon heads growing from his shoulders, each one capable of breathing different types of destruction. Fire poured from one, freezing ice from another, acidic venom from a third. Other sources say he had one main head, vaguely human but twisted and terrible, while hundreds of snake heads emerged from his body. His eyes blazed with fire that could melt stone. His mouth could swallow whole buildings. When he spoke, his voice contained multitudes, sometimes bellowing like a bull, sometimes roaring like a lion, sometimes barking like a pack of dogs, sometimes hissing like serpents, sometimes emitting sounds no mortal language could describe. Typhon's very existence was an affront to order. He represented raw chaos, nature at its most violent and uncontrollable. Where Zeus brought law and structure, Typhon brought destruction and entropy. Where the Olympians represented civilized power, Typhon was the wild fury of the earth itself. When he emerged from his birthplace in Cilicia, a region in what's now southern Turkey, and began his march toward Olympus, the gods recognized immediately that this was different from any threat they'd faced before. This wasn't a war that could be won through military strategy. This was elemental conflict, order versus chaos. And the outcome would determine whether the world could exist as anything other than primordial destruction. The gods panicked. According to some versions, when Typhon approached, the Olympians transformed themselves into animals and fled to Egypt, hiding from the monster's wrath. Aphrodite became a fish. Artemis turned into a cat. Apollo became a crow. Hermes transformed into an ibis. They scattered and hid, seeking safety in distance and disguise. Only Athena remained on Olympus, standing firm, and when she saw her father Zeus hesitating, she shamed him into action. A goddess of wisdom and war, reminding the king of gods that fleeing was not an option, that his throne meant standing against threats, even when victory wasn't certain. Zeus, gathering his courage and his power, prepared for battle. He armed himself with his thunderbolts, the weapons that had defeated the Titans, and marched out to meet Typhon. The confrontation began in the skies above the earth, two titanic powers meeting in aerial combat. Zeus hurled thunderbolt after thunderbolt, each one striking with the force of a volcanic eruption. The sky filled with lightning, brilliant and terrible, each flash illuminating Typhon's monstrous form. The creature barely flinched. His multiple heads breathed fire back at Zeus, streams of flame hot enough to melt the bronze gates of Olympus. The earth below shook with their conflict. Mountains crumbled, forests burned, the sea boiled where Poseidon watched from below, unable to intervene in this aerial duel. The fight was more brutal than anything Zeus had experienced. Typhon was stronger than he'd anticipated, faster, more resilient. The monster's 100 hands grabbed at Zeus, trying to drag him down, trying to tear him apart. At one point, Typhon succeeded in getting Zeus into his grip. The king of gods struggled, lightning crackling around him, but Typhon's strength was overwhelming. The monster pinned Zeus down, and then, with terrible precision, used blades made from adamantine, the hardest substance in existence, to cut the tendons from Zeus's hands and feet. The sinews that allowed movement, that gave his body power, were severed and removed. Crippled, helpless, Zeus was dragged to a cave in Cilicia. Typhon stored the divine tendons in a bearskin bag and left them guarded by another monster, the she-dragon Delphine, half woman and half serpent. Zeus lay in the cave, more powerless than he'd ever been, unable even to move, his divine body betrayed by the simple removal of connective tissue. Typhon left him there and began his assault on Olympus proper, confident that the greatest threat to his dominance had been neutralized. For a moment, it seemed the prophecy had come true in a way no one expected. Not that Zeus would be overthrown by his son, but that he would be overthrown by an uncle, by a creature born from the same primordial powers that had birthed the Titans. But Zeus was not without allies. Hermes, the clever messenger god, managed to enter the cave undetected. he found Zeus lying there, watching over the godly sinews. With Pan's help, the god of the wild, Hermes distracted or defeated Delphine and recovered the stolen tendons. They carefully reattached them to Zeus's body. Divine flesh healed quickly once the connection was restored, and within moments, Zeus could move again. His power flooded back, rage and determination mixing into something terrible and focused. He would not be defeated by this monster. He would not allow chaos to tear down everything he'd built. Zeus erupted from the cave like a storm given form. He flew straight back to Olympus, gathered every thunderbolt the Cyclopes could forge, and returned to the battle with renewed fury. The second round of fighting was even more intense than the first. Zeus no longer held back. He struck Typhon again and again, lightning bolts raining down in a ceaseless barrage. The monster's heads were set ablaze, fire meeting fire. The creature's own heat weapon turned against him. Typhon tried to respond, tried to mount a defense, but Zeus was relentless. He struck from every angle, diving and weaving, using his control over the sky to stay out of reach while hammering Typhon with destructive force. The turning point came when Zeus used his ultimate weapon. He lifted Mount Etna, the entire volcanic mountain, and hurled it at Typhon. The mountain crashed down on the monster, pinning him beneath its massive weight. Typhon struggled, his 100 heads screaming in rage and pain, his serpentine lower body writhing, trying to escape. But Zeus poured his power into that mountain, binding Typhon beneath it, imprisoning him as he had imprisoned the Titans in Tartarus. The volcano's fire was Typhon's own heat, trapped and redirected. When Etna erupts, it's Typhon's rage trying to break free. When earthquakes shake Sicily, it's the monster shifting beneath his prison, still struggling after all these ages. Some versions say Zeus didn't use Etna, but instead cast Typhon down into Tartarus, the same prison that held the Titans, adding one more prisoner to that lightless abyss. Other accounts place Typhon under different mountains, or on the island of Ischia. The location varied in the telling, but the result was always the same. Typhon was defeated, imprisoned, removed as a threat. Zeus had survived the greatest challenge to his rule, a challenge that had literally crippled him, and he had emerged victorious. The battle with Typhon changed Zeus in subtle ways. He had been humbled, shown his own vulnerability, reminded that power alone wasn't enough to guarantee victory. He became more cautious afterward, more aware of potential threats. He also became more certain of his right to rule, having proven that he could overcome even a monster created specifically to destroy him. The Olympian order was secure. No more challenges would come that Zeus couldn't handle, or so he believed. But while Typhon was the last great cosmic threat, while no monster would again threaten Olympus itself, Zeus's rule would be tested in other ways, through his own decisions, through his treatment of mortals, through the complex web of relationships and offspring that would spread his influence across the world while simultaneously creating new problems, new tragedies, new stories. Zeus had established himself as undisputed king, but what does it mean to be king of gods and mortals? What responsibilities come with absolute power? Zeus's role extended far beyond simply sitting on a throne and throwing lightning bolts. He was the dispenser of justice, the keeper of oaths, the protector of guests and strangers, the god who maintained cosmic order against the constant pull of chaos. He held two great urns, according to Homer, one filled with blessings and one with sorrows. From these urns, he distributed fate to mortals, deciding who would prosper and who would suffer, mixing blessings and curses as he saw fit. One of Zeus's most important roles was as guardian of oaths. When anyone, mortal or immortal, swore an oath, they swore by the river Styx, and Zeus enforced those oaths. Breaking an oath sworn on the Styx meant incurring Zeus's wrath, and that wrath could take many forms. Lightning strikes were the most direct, a bolt from the sky, judgment rendered in an instant. But Zeus was also known for more subtle punishments. allowing oath-breakers to succeed temporarily before arranging their downfall, teaching hard lessons about the importance of keeping one's word. Zeus also protected the sacred relationship between guest and host. This was called xenia in Greek, and it was foundational to ancient society. Travelers needed to trust that they would be treated well by strangers, and hosts needed to trust that guests wouldn't abuse their hospitality. Zeus enforced this through his aspect as Zeus Xenios, the protector of strangers. Anyone who harmed a guest, or anyone who abused a host's generosity, would face divine punishment. The story of Baucis and Philemon illustrates this beautifully. Zeus and Hermes, disguised as poor travelers, sought shelter from 1,000 homes and were turned away every time. Only an elderly couple, Baucis and Philemon, opened their doors and shared what little they had. Zeus rewarded them by transforming their humble home into a temple and granting them their wish to die at the same moment, so neither would have to live without the other. The town that had refused hospitality was flooded and destroyed. Zeus's justice could be harsh, but it followed a logic, a code. Hubris, excessive pride that caused mortals to overreach their station or claim equality with gods, was punished severely. Arachne, who claimed her weaving surpassed Athena's, was transformed into a spider. Niobe, who boasted of having more children than Leto, watched all 14 of her children killed by Apollo and Artemis, before being turned to stone, eternally weeping. Ixion, who lusted after Hera, was bound to a flaming wheel in Tartarus, spinning forever. These punishments weren't arbitrary cruelty. They were lessons, reminders that there was an order to the cosmos, a hierarchy that had to be respected. But Zeus's relationship with mortals was more complex than simple judgment and punishment. He also fathered children with mortal women, creating a bloodline of heroes who would shape human history. These unions were controversial even in ancient times, with later philosophers questioning why a god would lower himself to such entanglements. But from Zeus's perspective, these affairs served multiple purposes. They created bonds between heaven and earth. They introduced divine bloodlines into human kingdoms, legitimizing rulers and establishing cult centers. They produced heroes who could deal with threats that gods themselves couldn't or wouldn't address directly, monsters that plagued the mortal world, injustices that needed mortal agency to correct. These were handled by Zeus's half-divine children. The most famous of these mortal liaisons involved Alcmene, a princess of Mycenae married to Amphitryon. Zeus desired her for her virtue as much as her beauty. She was known as one of the most righteous women of her age, faithful to her husband, dedicated to justice. Zeus took the form of Amphitryon himself, appearing to Alcmene on a night when her real husband was away at war. He even extended that night to 3 times its normal length, wanting to savor the time with her. From this union came Heracles, or Hercules as the Romans would call him, the greatest hero of Greek mythology. Heracles' life would be complicated by Zeus's infidelity. Hera, learning of yet another affair, yet another illegitimate child, turned her considerable wrath toward this infant. She sent serpents to strangle Heracles in his cradle, but even as a baby, he possessed such strength that he throttled the snakes instead, laughing as he did so. This was only the beginning of Hera's persecution. Throughout his life, Heracles would face trials orchestrated by the Queen of Heaven, most famously the 12 labors, that would take him across the known world, forcing him to battle monsters and complete impossible tasks. Yet these trials also made him a legend, transforming him from merely a strong man into a cultural icon. When Heracles finally died, consumed by poisoned blood, Zeus lifted him to Olympus and granted him immortality, making him the only mortal ever to become a full god. Hera, in a surprising twist, even reconciled with him, giving him her daughter Hebe as a wife. Another famous mortal affair involved Danae, princess of Argos. Her father, King Acrisius, had been warned by an oracle that his grandson would kill him. To prevent this, he locked Danae in a bronze tower, ensuring she could never be with a man and bear children. But Zeus, intrigued by her beauty and the challenge, transformed himself into a shower of golden rain that seeped through the tower's roof and into Danae's lap. She became pregnant with Perseus, who would grow up to be one of mythology's greatest heroes, slayer of Medusa, rescuer of Andromeda, founder of Mycenae. The prophecy, of course, came true despite Acrisius's precautions. Perseus accidentally killed his grandfather with a discus throw at athletic games years later, proving once again that trying to avoid fate only makes it come true in unexpected ways. Zeus seduced Leda, queen of Sparta, by transforming into a swan. Some versions say he was fleeing an eagle, and Leda took pity on him, only for him to take advantage of her compassion. From this unusual union, Leda laid eggs, from which hatched 4 children. Helen, who would become Helen of Troy, the most beautiful woman in the world, whose face would launch 1,000 ships. Pollux, who would become one of the Dioscuri, the divine twins. And from her human husband Tyndareus on the same night, she bore Clytemnestra and Castor, the mortal twins. These children would shape the fate of Greece, Helen's abduction triggering the Trojan War, Clytemnestra murdering Agamemnon upon his return, the twins becoming constellation gods. Europa, a Phoenician princess, caught Zeus's eye while she played on a beach. He transformed into a magnificent white bull, gentle and beautiful, adorned with flowers. Europa and her companions were charmed by the creature. She climbed onto its back, and Zeus immediately leaped into the sea, swimming with her across the Mediterranean to Crete. There he revealed himself and made love to her beneath a plane tree. From their union came 3 sons who would become kings and judges: Minos, who would rule Crete and later judge souls in the underworld; Rhadamanthus, known for his justice; and Sarpedon, who would fight at Troy. The continent of Europe itself took its name from this princess, whom Zeus abducted. Perhaps most tragically, Zeus fell in love with Semele, a mortal princess of Thebes. He visited her in disguise, and she became pregnant with his child. But Hera, discovering the affair, disguised herself as an old woman and visited Semele. She planted seeds of doubt, suggesting that Zeus wasn't really Zeus, that perhaps Semele's lover was lying about his identity. How could she be sure? There was only one way: make him appear in his true form, as he appeared to Hera. Semele, manipulated by Hera's cruel wisdom, asked Zeus to grant her a wish and made him swear on the river Styx to honor it. Then she asked to see him as he truly was. Zeus knew this would kill her. No mortal could witness a god's true form and survive. But he had sworn on the Styx, and even he could not break that oath. With tears in his eyes, Zeus revealed himself, lightning blazing around him, power unmasked, and Semele was instantly incinerated. But Zeus acted quickly. He snatched their unborn child from her womb and sewed the fetus into his own thigh, carrying it to term himself. When the time came, Dionysus was born from Zeus's body, making him twice born, born first from mother and then from father. Dionysus would grow up to become god of wine, ecstasy, and theatre, his cult celebrating the breakdown of normal boundaries, perhaps reflecting his own unusual origins. These are just a few of the many mortal women Zeus loved, seduced, or abducted. There were dozens more, each story following a similar pattern. Zeus sees a woman, desires her, disguises himself to approach her, fathers a child, and then largely abandons both mother and child to deal with the consequences, which often included Hera's vengeful attention. It's not a flattering picture of the king of gods. His behavior toward women was, by any modern standard, predatory and irresponsible. He wielded his power to take what he wanted, transformed into animals or other people to deceive his targets, and rarely stuck around to face the aftermath of his actions. Yet, in the ancient Greek context, these stories served important cultural functions. They explained the origins of heroes and royal lineages. They created connections between different city-states through shared divine ancestry. They illustrated the dangerous unpredictability of divine power, showing that even the king of gods was ruled by passion as much as justice. And they reflected real-world power dynamics, where powerful men did as they pleased, while women bore the consequences. The myths didn't necessarily endorse this behavior, but they acknowledged it, portrayed it with all its complications and cruelties. What did Zeus himself think of these affairs? It's hard to say. Some myths portray him as genuinely in love with his mortal partners, if only temporarily. Others suggest he was driven by an insatiable appetite for novelty and conquest. He certainly didn't seem troubled by the pain his actions caused, either to the women he seduced or to Hera, his wife. Perhaps after eons of existence, after defeating titans and monsters, after establishing cosmic order, he felt entitled to whatever pleasures he desired. Or perhaps, like many powerful figures throughout history, he simply never questioned whether he should do something once he'd decided he wanted it. Power, after all, brings not just ability, but often a dangerous lack of self-reflection. Zeus's symbols were well known throughout the ancient world, each one carrying layers of meaning. The thunderbolt was his most famous attribute, a zigzagging bolt of pure electricity that he wielded like a spear. When mortals saw lightning split the sky, they saw Zeus's judgment, his power, his ability to strike anywhere without warning. The thunderbolt represented ultimate authority, the final word in any dispute. The Cyclopes had forged it as a gift, but Zeus made it an extension of his own will. In art, he's almost always shown holding or wielding his thunderbolt, the defining image of his power. The eagle was his sacred animal, the king of birds serving the king of gods. Eagles were seen as Zeus's messengers, his eyes in the mortal world. When an eagle appeared, especially in unusual circumstances, it was interpreted as a sign from Zeus, either blessing or warning depending on the context. Zeus himself sometimes took the form of an eagle, most famously when he abducted Ganymede, a beautiful Trojan prince, carrying him to Olympus to be his cupbearer. The eagle represented Zeus's ability to see everything from on high, his perspective that encompassed all of creation, his swift and decisive action when necessary. The oak tree was sacred to Zeus, particularly at his oracle in Dodona, one of the oldest religious sites in Greece. The rustling of oak leaves in the wind was interpreted as Zeus's voice, his priests listening to the whispers of the trees and divining the god's will. Oak was strong, enduring, capable of surviving for centuries, much like Zeus's own eternal reign. Acorns, the oak's fruit, became symbols of Zeus as well, representing fertility and the seed of divine power. At the Olympic Games, which were held in Zeus's honor, victors were crowned with wreaths made from olive branches, but the oak remained his primary tree. The bull appeared in many Zeus myths, particularly stories of his shape-shifting seductions. As a bull, Zeus abducted Europa. As a bull, he mated with Demeter. The bull represented raw masculine power, fertility, strength, the animal force that could not be denied. Bulls were sacrificed to Zeus in important rituals, their strength offered back to the god who embodied strength itself. The association ran deep enough that in some very ancient cults, before the Olympian gods were fully defined, Zeus may have been worshipped as a bull deity, only later taking fully human form in art and story. Zeus's other attributes included the aegis, a shield or breastplate often decorated with the head of the Gorgon Medusa. Though most commonly associated with Athena, the aegis originally belonged to Zeus, and he lent it to his daughter when she needed it. The aegis represented protection, divine armor that could not be penetrated. When Zeus shook the aegis, it produced storm clouds and thunder, making enemies flee in terror. He also carried a royal scepter, symbol of his kingship, a rod of authority that marked him as supreme ruler even when he wasn't actively wielding his thunderbolt. Zeus's worship was widespread, with temples and sanctuaries dedicated to him across the Greek world. The most famous was the Temple of Zeus at Olympia, home to one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world. The statue of Zeus at Olympia, created by the sculptor Phidias around 435 BCE, stood over 40 feet tall, depicting the god seated on an elaborate throne, his skin made of ivory, his robes of gold. His right hand held a statue of Nike, goddess of victory. His left hand held his scepter with an eagle perched on top. The statue was so magnificent that ancient visitors reported being moved to tears by its beauty and majesty. It stood for nearly 800 years before being destroyed, either in a fire or dismantled when Christianity replaced the old gods. But its memory survived in countless descriptions and reproductions. The Olympic Games themselves were founded in Zeus's honor, beginning in 776 BCE, according to tradition, though likely older. Held every 4 years at Olympia, the Games brought together competitors from across the Greek world. During the Games, a sacred truce was declared, and all warfare ceased so athletes could travel safely to compete. This was Zeus Olympios, exercising his authority as god of justice and social order, creating a space where Greeks could celebrate their shared culture and physical excellence without the constant threat of war. Winners were crowned with olive wreaths and gained tremendous prestige, their victories seen as blessed by Zeus himself. Another important cult center was Dodona in northwestern Greece, where Zeus's oracle spoke through the rustling of sacred oak trees. This oracle was older than the famous one at Delphi, which belonged to Apollo. At Dodona, priests called Seloi interpreted the sound of wind through oak leaves, the flight patterns of birds, and other natural signs to discern Zeus's will. People traveled from across the Mediterranean to ask questions of the oracle, everything from personal matters to state policies. The responses were famously ambiguous, requiring interpretation, but that didn't diminish their authority. If Zeus's oracle at Dodona said something would happen, people prepared for it. Numerous festivals honored Zeus throughout the year. The Diasia, celebrated in Athens, involved sacrifices and rituals to Zeus Melichios, Zeus in his aspect as a chthonic, underworld deity associated with purification and agricultural fertility. The Nemean Games, held every 2 years at Nemea, honored Zeus Nemean and included athletic competitions similar to the Olympics. Local cults and regional variations meant that Zeus was worshipped in dozens of different forms, each emphasizing a particular aspect of his nature. Zeus Polyeus protected the city. Zeus Soter was the savior. Zeus Heracles guarded the household. Each name, each cult, each ritual added another layer to the understanding of who Zeus was and what he meant to ancient Greeks. When Rome conquered Greece, they identified Zeus with their own king of gods, Jupiter. Jupiter had originally been an Italic sky god, similar in many ways to Zeus, but with his own distinct identity and myths. As the cultures merged, Jupiter and Zeus became essentially the same deity, Jupiter gaining Zeus's elaborate mythology, while Zeus gained Jupiter's Roman name and influence. Jupiter Optimus Maximus, best and greatest, ruled from the Capitoline Hill in Rome, much as Zeus ruled from Mount Olympus. Roman emperors associated themselves with Jupiter, claiming divine sanction for their rule, continuing the pattern Zeus had established of divine kings legitimizing earthly power. Zeus's legacy extended beyond his own worship. He fundamentally shaped how Western culture thinks about divine power, paternal authority, justice, and sovereignty. The concept of a supreme god who rules over both lesser deities and mortal affairs, who dispenses justice while being subject to fate, who combines power with all too human flaws. This template was established by Zeus and has influenced religious thinking ever since. Even the Christian God, though radically different in many ways, inherited some conceptual traits from Zeus through the religious and philosophical developments that bridged pagan antiquity and Christian theology. The idea of God the Father, seated on a heavenly throne, judging humanity, wielding absolute power, these images carry echoes of Zeus Olympios. In literature and art throughout history, Zeus has remained a potent figure. Renaissance artists rediscovered Greek mythology, and depicted Zeus in countless paintings and sculptures. The Baroque period especially loved the dramatic potential of Zeus's myths, painting his transformations, his battles, his affairs with lush color and dynamic composition. The Romantic era reimagined Zeus as a symbol of natural power and sublime terror, the god who embodied the awesome destructive beauty of storms. Modern reinterpretations have ranged from psychoanalytic readings where Zeus represents the father figure or the superego, to feminist critiques that examine his treatment of women, to pop culture portrayals in everything from Disney's Hercules to Rick Riordan's Percy Jackson series. What can we say, at the end of this long journey through Zeus's story, about who he was and what he represented? Zeus was power, first and foremost. Power to overthrow his father, power to defeat cosmic monsters, power to rule gods and mortals alike, power to take what he wanted, whether that was a throne or a woman. But he was also order, the force that established laws, that enforced oaths, that maintained the structure of reality against chaos. He was justice, even when his personal behavior seemed anything but just. He was the sky, the weather, the lightning that could strike at any moment. Zeus was also deeply flawed. His infidelities were legendary, his treatment of women often reprehensible, his pride sometimes pushing him into questionable decisions. He swallowed Metis to prevent a son from overthrowing him, repeating his father's pattern of fear-driven cruelty, even as he claimed to be different. He punished mortals harshly for offenses that he himself committed with impunity. He allowed his wife to torment his illegitimate children, standing aside while Hera made Heracles' life a living torment, or drove Io across the world in the form of a cow stung by an incessant gadfly. These flaws made him relatable in ways a perfect god could never be. The Greeks didn't want their gods to be moral paragons. They wanted them to be powerful, to be impressive, to embody the forces that shaped existence. That Zeus was flawed, that he struggled, that he sometimes failed. This made him more understandable, more human, despite his divinity. Zeus represents the paradox at the heart of power. It's necessary for order, for justice, for protection of the weak, but it's also dangerous, prone to abuse, capable of tremendous cruelty. Zeus used his power to overthrow a tyrant and establish a better system, but then used that same power to pursue his own desires, regardless of consequences. He was the protector of guests and strangers, but also the god who abducted women in animal forms. He dispensed justice but was not subject to it himself. This contradiction wasn't something the Greeks tried to resolve. They simply accepted it as part of what divine power meant. Gods were not bound by the same rules as mortals. That was what made them gods. The story of Zeus, from his desperate birth in a Cretan cave to his eternal rule from Mount Olympus, is ultimately a story about power, succession, order, and the cost of both gaining and maintaining authority. It's about how the universe came to have structure, how justice became possible, how civilization could exist. But it's also about ambition, fear, lust, jealousy, all the emotions that drive both gods and mortals. Zeus was not a being to be emulated. He was a force to be reckoned with, a reality to be acknowledged, a power that simply was, for better and worse. Tonight, we've walked the complete journey of the King of Gods, from the moment Rhea tricked Cronus with a stone to the establishment of Zeus's seemingly eternal reign. We've witnessed his battles, his marriages, his countless affairs, his children who would reshape the world. We've seen him at his most powerful, hurling thunderbolts at Typhon, and at his most vulnerable, tendons cut and lying helpless in a cave. We've explored his symbols, his worship, his influence that extends even to our modern world. Zeus remains one of mythology's most complex figures, a god who shaped the cosmos and Greek culture, whose stories have been told and retold for thousands of years, whose image still evokes power and authority whenever lightning splits the sky. His reign may have been flawed, his personal life a disaster, his justice uneven, but his impact was undeniable. He was, and remains, the king of gods, the ruler of Olympus, the wielder of thunder, and his story continues to fascinate us because it reflects our own struggles with power, authority, family, and the eternal question of what it means to rule. If you enjoyed this deep exploration into Zeus's mythology, please like this video and subscribe to the channel. There are so many more stories to explore, so many more gods and heroes whose tales deserve to be told in the quiet of the evening, in that space where ancient myth and modern imagination meet. Until next time, keep looking to the stars, keep listening for thunder, and remember that the old stories never truly die. They simply wait for new voices to tell them again. Good night.